Hi, folks. So I don't actually have much of a pre-lecture this week. Instead, you'll see that for this week, you have a short video to watch and then some reading to do. And then I really wanted to spend our time together over Collaborate, working through an exercise and going over some of the discussion questions. So the purpose for this topic is, you might recall that I mentioned that one of our goals for this class is not only to become familiar with the anthropological perspective and to apply it in our examination of gender and aging from a cross-cultural perspective, but we're also going to be critical or do a critique of kind of anthropology and anthropological concepts as well. And so one of the ways that I like to kind of critique the anthropological perspective is also looking at kind of the broader context under which people have had discussions relating more specifically to gender than aging, but this aging is also relevant to this as well. And so this topic is meant just to provide you with some basic background on gender movements and then some core concepts that we're going to be revisiting throughout the course. So the first is intersectionality, which is very closely linked with gender movements. And so intersectionality, and specifically intersectional feminism, is something we're going to be incorporating as part of how we apply the anthropological perspective in this course. But then we also need to talk a little bit about how globalization and colonialism have shaped not only our understandings of gender and aging, but also how these forces have shaped other cultures and other communities, and also how colonialism in particular has shaped anthropology as a discipline. So again, we have to acknowledge, if we're going to be applying the anthropological perspective, that there are other concepts, other theories, other methods that have influenced anthropology. And feminism is certainly one that has shaped anthropologies of gender. So we need to define feminism a little bit. And so you'll see the reading I've given to you from an excellent open education resource textbook, because this is something our textbook for the course does not have, provides us with a brief historical background to the four waves of feminism. And so I have reviewed those and provided some brief notes here. I just wanted to comment that next week, when we talk a little bit more about doing anthropology and the ethnographic method, we'll talk about specifically the work of Margaret Mead and Zora Neale Hurston, so I was really glad that they were featured in this particular text. So you'll note that there's several waves of feminism leading us to this date, where we find ourselves situated in an understanding of feminism and an approach within feminism that is attempting to move beyond white and honestly cis women or cis female perspectives and experiences. And so it's meant to be a lot more holistic. And so fourth wave feminism or intersectional feminism, which has its origin in the 90s with third wave feminism as well, is a lot more, in my opinion, anthropological as well. It's also, as the text does a great job of explaining, is derived from a lot of social justice movements. And so when you listen to the video, you'll hear this, that Kimberly Crenshaw, who gave us the concept of intersectionality, talks about the importance of intersectional feminism and intersectionality in addressing some of the broader problems that not just our society, but many societies are facing. So this includes things like sexual harassment and violence. The key thing I want to emphasize here is that feminism is a position, and intersectional feminism is a position that argues that all genders are inherently of equal worth. And so this is a reaction to, again, the various waves that came before, and also larger structural sources of inequity and inequality that we face in society. And we're going to talk about inequality and inequity and justice a little bit later on in the course. So again, this is just meant to be a brief introduction before we get into some of that work. Another key point here is also argues that not all women are the same. So the video I'm having you watch this week is a TEDx talk, or a TEDx talk that was done by legal scholars mentioned here, Kimberly Crenshaw. I will note there's a bit of a content warning with it at about the 12-minute mark. Crenshaw goes into some very explicit examples of violence that have been directed towards women of color, in particular of Black women in the United States. It's a very powerful moment. I can't make it through this video without responding to it quite emotionally, but so if that's something that's triggering to you, that's a good point to stop. Most of the content we'll be discussing in class occurs before that, so where Crenshaw talks about how she developed this concept and this term and what are the major principles that intersectionality encompasses. And then in class, we're going to go over a bit of an exercise. So I have first a little thought piece where I want you to think about your own identity and how it works on this kind of axis. And then we're going to examine how it reflects various dynamics of power and powerlessness, or what we might call oppression and privilege. And I have myself here plotted out as an example to show how I am quite a privileged individual, and we'll talk about some of these different ways that I experience also oppression, and then we can have a bit of a dialogue around some other ways and other aspects of our identity that this axis or this wheel does not capture. And then I go through in the notes here some other examples that also go over how privilege and power and our various intersecting identities play out. So please work through this and we'll talk about it more. And part of our goal for talking about intersectionality, for starting to think about our own situation, is because one of our goals, if we want to avoid ethnocentric bias, is to kind of recognize other sources of bias more broadly. And this will become really important when we talk about ethnography and reflexivity, and how anthropologists actually do anthropology, because identifying and being explicit about bias and who we are is central to that process. And then I included this pyramid of oppression here, or of bias, to show how, bias is kind of the smallest, it's the largest level. This is where, most of us are going to either participate in systems of oppression or contribute to them, and then how bias contributes to prejudice, how prejudice then develops into forms of discrimination, which then can result in violence, and then at the very top can unfortunately result in even genocide, whether there is the intentional and deliberate act to eliminate a group of people. And so by identifying bias, the goal is that we can cause this pyramid to crumble, right? That if we're acknowledging sources of bias, if we're attempting to address bias within our own society and correct these things, that we can prevent these more violent forms of oppression from occurring in our society. So that's how we can cause change. So the question I have for you is, how does bias shape our understanding of gender and sex? How does bias shape our understanding of identity, or of aging as well? And again, we're going to talk about this throughout the course, so it's not that I expect you to have explicit answers at this point, but this topic is meant to kind of provoke thought as we move forward and start to get into some more specific topics relating to cross-cultural perspectives on gender and aging. So here's some discussion questions I've come up with for the video. I've already mentioned again the content warning, and so we'll talk about these. And I just wanted to capture this very critical quote, something that Crenshaw mentioned several times in her video, in her TEDx talk, which is that if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem. And so to me, this is really at the root of identifying bias, right? Is that bias is a problem. It's a source of a problem, and we can't address it unless we acknowledge that it exists. And we all have various forms of bias, myself included. Then the other topics we're going to talk about, again, so this is just meant to serve as an introduction, is globalization and colonialism, and again, the reading, and then my notes here provide some definitions for these concepts, and we'll talk about these a little bit more. These are not, again, concepts that are unique to anthropology, so I'm sure many of you will have talked about these in your other courses, and so I did want to open the floor to discussion on Thursday where we can talk about these a little bit more. In terms of colonialism, you'll notice that I've focused on the Canadian experience. And part of this is part of my commitment to addressing the calls to action in truth and reconciliation, is looking at how colonialism has played out here in Canada. And I would like you to think about how Canada, as being a nation that was formed through the process of colonialism, thinking about how this might shape anthropologists that come from Canada, and also the kinds of work that anthropologists do, the kind of questions that we have. And I also want you to think about how this has shaped or has possibly shaped or potentially shaped the experience of Indigenous peoples in regards explicitly to anthropology. And we saw some of this in our videos from last week relating to two-spirit individuals and the work of Dr. James McCocus, and how colonialism has greatly shaped people's experiences, Indigenous people's experiences of gender. Another thing that's really important to me when it comes to talking about colonialism is also in terms of providing resources. So those of you who are unfamiliar with treaties, and no, sorry, I apologize, I have some outdated terminology. I need to update this relating to Indigenous is the preferred term because it's much more inclusive in terms of recognizing cultural variation, some of the distinctions made between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit populations, between treaty and non-treaty or status and non-status individuals. So my apologies for that. I will correct that right away here, but I did want to provide some resources to folks relating to treaties. So if you don't have some of that historical background, here's some information about it. Again, optional resources for you. The other thing that I want to talk a little bit is again about the Truth and Reconciliation of Commission. And again, here is a bunch of resources related to that and how the role of anthropologists and us moving forward, the role we can play in truth and reconciliation. So we'll talk a little bit about this. And again, here are some other questions that I would like you to consider relating to the concepts that we'll be talking about on Thursday, and then also to anthropology and the anthropological perspective. And again, it's not that I expect you to have answers to these questions at this point, but now I want these to be major questions that are going to guide our work moving forward this term in this course. And then here's some specific discussion questions that come from our assigned reading for this week. And these are the kinds of questions that you can and should be able to answer in relation to our course wiki. So some heavy content this week, but I think very important, again, before we dive into explicitly the content of this course. I'm looking forward to having a productive discussion with you folks around this, and for you coming and sharing your experiences and your knowledge and background on these topics. So that, yeah, we can have a great conversation around it. So see you folks then.